Recently, I've asked myself the question of why do people read visual novels? What captivates someone enough to stare transfixed at a screen, reading text for hours on end? Why do this instead of playing a video game or reading a book? Visual novels are something I've been into for years, but I understand that it might be seen as a weird genre to outsiders. Here, I seek to outline what I find so enthralling about visual novels. To make myself clear, in this discussion I'll be talking about kinetic novels or sound novels, where the majority of the time spent playing will be reading text, though no Danganronpa rants or Utawari Ramono. Several gameplay elements whose status as a visual novel is contentious. First, a brief history lesson on why these kinds of games got made in the first place. The origins of visual novels go back to the 1980s with adventure games like Autopia's Serial Murder Case. Otogarisu in 1992 was marketed as a sound novel, differing it from adventure games in the past by having linear text of a novel with an emphasis on atmospheric sound effects. It was made to be accessible to anyone that could read. I think this philosophy is part of the genre's success. You don't need gaming skills like memorizing combos or fast reaction time to play visual novels. They're easy to pick up and read, like actual novels. The first game that could really be called a visual novel was Shizuku in 1996, which put a much greater focus on the visuals in conveying its story, unlike the sound novels previously, which were very basic in that regard. It was developed by Leap, which later produced other visual novels that shaped the industry, like Two Heart, a work that popularized the idea of heroine routes. However, this was all in Japan, and to this day a lot of these classics haven't seen English translations. The term visual novel didn't really get traction in the West until 2012, with the release of Katawa Shoujo, a visual novel made by 4chan users that exploded in popularity. Of course, there are releases of English VNs before Katawa Shoujo, but this is the first time one had received such attention. Personally, I can't say I like Katawa Shoujo very much, but I respect it for starting a cult following for visual novels, which paved the way for the success they see in the West today. Now, this history might have been somewhat enlightening, but it doesn't answer the primary question. What drew so many people to works like Katawa Shoujo and Shizuku? Why do people still talk about them today? Why do people read visual novels? I already mentioned accessibility before, as I'm sure it is a factor, however minor. That Katawa Shoujo is freeware has undeniably helped it grow. Same goes for Doki Doki Literature Club. I believe that the biggest reason people read visual novels is the vast storytelling potential of them. They have the depth of writing a novel by having visual flair and music. There are many video games with brilliant stories, but they often can't have as much detail as a novel, with them being totally different mediums. Anime naturally relies more on things like visual storytelling. This can be seen in anime adaptations of visual novels, but they often cut out inner monologues because they're uncommon in anime, leading to very different perspectives for characters like Shiro Emiya, depending on whether the person has only seen the anime or actually read the VN. That kind of detail is not always a positive. Visual novels have a reputation for sometimes being meandering and not progressing the plot. Grace Stay Night, for instance, is often criticized because Shiro seems more occupied with his cooking plans than the Holy Grail were at times. Of course, I think these kinds of complaints are somewhat exaggerated. Not every visual novel suffers from pacing issues, but things like that do happen. The presentation is the most obvious advantage visual novels have over books. It certainly makes them more palatable for a wider audience. I've heard people call visual novels Japanese choose-your-own adventure books, and while that's not a totally inaccurate statement, it feels a bit belittling to the amount of work that goes into these games. I think that people severely underestimate how a good presentation can elevate a story. Take, for instance, Umineko no Naku Koro ni. It's a mostly well-regarded visual novel, but can be polarizing. One thing that's not controversial is the soundtrack. It's almost universally agreed to be one of the most impressive ever. It encapsulates all the emotions the story is trying to convey at the right time, from the sorrow of losing a loved one, to the hype of a truly battle between witches. The dread and despair of the slowly dwindling number of people on Rokkenjima can be felt with the ominous soundtrack. It can't be understated how pivotal the music is in conveying the atmosphere. Just take a look at the Umineko manga. It's a surprisingly great and faithful adaptation. Each episode is illustrated by a different artist, giving each episode a unique art style. It looks stellar, but it comes at a cost of there being no music, which makes reading the manga feel like a totally different experience. You could always listen to the Umineko OST in the background while reading, but it still isn't quite the same. Each scene has a song to accompany it, and it suddenly changing or stopping can indicate a shift in atmosphere, something you just can't get in the manga. That's not to even mention the voice acting. Every voice actor in Umineko gives a spectacular performance. Then there's the sound effects like the iconic glass breaking sound or the eerie witches laughing. It all goes to show that even while the Umineko manga is fantastic and does justice to the message of the story, it's still a fundamentally different experience. All the music and voice acting is an important part of making the visual novel what it is, and that goes for all visual novels. The thing that visual novels do exceptionally well is getting the audience immersed and invested in the main protagonist. Some visual novels have protagonists that are supposed to be just self-inserts, but those are usually nukage. The best stories have protagonists that are real characters, with their own personality and goals. Visual novels have the advantage of giving long monologues about a character's feelings and ambitions, much the same way books do. How they differ is interactivity. Visual novels can have points where you have to make decisions as the character. All things the character could conceivably do, with this extra nuance there besides just trying to avoid bad endings and get on a character act. These characters are separate from who the reader is and what the reader is trying to accomplish, which gives a special layer separate from the deliberate urgings toward progress and exploration that adventure games might stress instead. Bring things back to Shiro Emiya, his early innate leanings towards a life of normalcy can create a disconnect with the reader wanting to roleplay his character. That disconnect is itself a means of characterization that's unique to the genre. His character is the point of view, and thus we're seeing the world through his eyes. The established setting, story, events, and such are also unfolding before the viewer's eye separate from Shiro. That divergence and difference in interest between the protagonist and reader can tell a lot about Shiro's character, especially in rereads or later routes where the newness of the VN's world in a reverse situation is much more applied to the work's characters than to the reader. This is part of why I believe that visual novel protagonists sometimes don't have voice acting. To imagine a character's own voice furthers immersion. Something that visual novels may handle even better than books or games is the concept of an unreliable narrator. We're not unheard of in novels, several of them like American Psycho. Even video games can have it, albeit rarely, maybe Final Fantasy VII to an extent. Visual novels have the potential to utilize it in interesting ways. In books, authors need to be careful to follow literary rules and still convey what they want. The leeway of how much they can lie to the audience is different than in a VN. Visual novels can use the visuals and music to deceive the audience as well as the text. For example, Umineko has scenes accompanied by light, fluffy imagery and music that's meant to misdirect the audience from recognizing what otherwise might be easily identified as heavy narrative or tonal notes. The extremely fallible perspectives can be given leaps of additional details because of the contrast with what the reader sees and hears with the novel genre conventions, which can create gaps for VN writers to take advantage of. Tsubehibe is another wonderful example of how a visual novel can handle multiple unreliable perspectives to form one cohesive narrative, using imagery and music that are at odds with the text to inform the audience that there may be more going on than what one would initially suspect. A unique and fascinating aspect of visual novels is the route structure. While not all visual novels do this, the ones that do can showcase the kind of storytelling that simply is not possible in a conventional book. Routes can give opportunities to explore characters in greater detail or show how the events of the stories could unfold differently. It's the best in stuff like Full Metal Daemon Muramasa, where each route explores a different character and theme, culminating in the final route that brings everything full circle. The way you choose routes in that game is a brilliant subversion of typical visual novel storytelling conventions that needs to be seen. Another visual novel with a phenomenal route structure is Fate Stay Night. Each of the three routes challenges Shiro's ideals in different ways, while also posing different opponents for him to face. Dies Arai has my favorite implementation of routes in any visual novel. The way they're incorporated into the overall narrative while reinforcing the themes of eternal reoccurrence and foreknowledge is sublime. These stories couldn't exist in anything other than a visual novel, or at least I don't think they'd be as effective. A very unfortunate stereotype is how all visual novels are seen as porn games by people who have never played them. As big as Fate is, it'll always be known as that series that started with a porn game, despite how the H scenes in that encompass less than 10% of the overall experience, or how there's a version without any of those scenes at all. The misconception that visual novels are pornographic is vexing, but I suppose might be understandable from an outside perspective. It is true that eroge play a central role in visual novels, as well as gaming in general, but it's also the reason why they'll always remain niche. There's a simple reason why so many VNs include H scenes, because that's what sells. Trying to sell people on time travel mystery story where you'll mostly scroll through text is hard, but if you tell people you can bang cute girls on the way, you can get the otaku dollars, or yen in this case. While it is a thing that's often included to sell copies, skilled writers have used H scenes in interesting ways, like having one to showcase how close two characters have become and further their relationship. You can't imagine stories like Maggot Bates, Euphoria, or Dead End Aegis without those scenes. H scenes are so integral to the tone, atmosphere, and setting of those stories. It's because of those stories that I've come to have a respect for H scenes. Not all H scenes are as well integrated as those, but at worst they're boring but inoffensive. Eroge allows the expression of ideas that wouldn't otherwise be allowed to be explored. I think that visual novels are allowed to be more experimental, as long as they have H scenes to sell copies, as seen in some of the stuff I mentioned before, or Black Cis VNs. The novelty of titillation can be used as a means by small indie developers to market their games without the fear of needing to compete with mainstream companies. Indeed, there are many incredible small developers and creators that were able to flourish in Eroge, like Leaf, Alisoft, NitroPlus, and Black Cis. Many auteurs got their start in Eroge, like Genrobuchi, who is known for writing anime like Madoka Magica, but got his start as a writer at NitroPlus, creating classics like Phantom of the Inferno, Kikokai the Cyber Slider, and of course Seiya no Uda. If visual novels are willing to explore sexuality and darker topics at all is interesting and something they can only get away with because they're niche. It's nice compared to how safe and sanitized mainstream media is, always going out of the way to be as inoffensive as possible. It's lame. To be clear, there is a subgenre of visual novels primarily focused on the pornographic content called nukuge, but those should not be seen as what a majority of VNs are like. If you don't want that kind of content, then simply don't read nukuge. Now, these were all looks that would make visual novels a fascinating genre and what might draw people to them. I'm sure everyone has their own reason to read. Personally, I read visual novels because they're fun, of course. Fun things are indeed fun. When I think back to it, I think what started my love of the genre was reading DSRI. I'd read other VNs before, like Fate, Umineko, and Fruit of Grisaya, but it's DSRI that took it from a passing interest to something I'm passionate about. They work so perfect and profound that it became one of my favorite works of fiction. It combines eloquent prose, memorable chuuni battles, discussions about philosophy, along with the most nuanced and likable cast. It's an utterly enthralling read that I still haven't seen the likes of again. It did open my eyes to the potential of visual novels. This came at a time when I was growing tired of watching anime. What used to be a source of wonder and excitement had become stale. I've seen far more anime than most people, and I've come to the conclusion that a lot of it is kinda bad. I continued watching it out of routine. Seeking out new visual novels to read brought that joy of discovering new forms of good storytelling. In the end, I hope this discussion could illuminate why people might be drawn to visual novels, or at least why I think they're neat. Please understand I am not trying to say that visual novels are better than other forms of media. That's ridiculous. Everything has its pros and cons. There are plenty of good visual novels, just as there are bad ones, same as movies or other kinds of games. I simply think that there are numerous fascinating stories that are told in the genre, a genre that is unfortunately underappreciated. I've heard it said that visual novels are dying, but I can't agree. Better now than ever in the West. Just recently, an official translation for Gore Screaming Show was announced, a Dark Guru classic that I've been interested in reading for a while. If it does well, then surely they'll translate more Black Cis games like Extravaganza and Gun Katana. There's also the translation of Tokyo Necro that got announced, another cool looking title from Nitroplus. Type Moon's Mahatsukai no Yoru is getting a release in English in the winter. Even on the Japan side, the first part of the Tsukihime remake came out last year. That's just one of the more noteworthy titles. In essence, now's a better time to read visual novels than ever, with more titles being released in English than ever. Now titles previously thought impossible have been translated, like Muramasa. There's a plethora of content to read. I think there's a visual novel for everyone. Want a funny slice of life story? There's Magikoi. Want a story of steampunk and cool world building? There's Gakden of the Golden Lightning. Want a realistic mystery thriller? There's Kara no Shoujo. Want something that's just weird? There's 428 Shibuya Scramble. There's enough variety in length, genre, and presentation to please anyone. That everything I wanted to say about the broad topic of visual novels. Thanks again to my good friend Chestnut Rants for helping with the script. If you've gotten this far, thanks for watching. I do have a question this time. Why do you read visual novels, or what is the title that made you want to read them? Let me know, I'm actually kinda curious.